Tom O'Leary. Shepherd. So,
but I'll tell you something,
I'm
truthfully.
going to get my bios, and then I'll follow Tom. Tom's going to open out because Mike's broken a tooth, apparently.
Oh, I think he's got, well, let's put it this way, my understanding he's got a lot more stuff that they're talking about, right? So they're,
Thank you for opening up the sessions.
We're getting some unfortunate hits on the health issues and stuff. Just people spread out all over and
well,
traffic.
certainly got names,
Yeah.
and that's the problem, that's the one thing. Why do you say they're having
Hopefully your health will be.
because you have to start thinking about what it is.
Yes, sir.
You know, what it is he's done
We,
is
you
extraditable.
ready, Dave?
I don't know what the
Ready when you
agreement
are.
is
You're
between
talking
them.
extraditable.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. I'm Tom O'Leary. I'm the Executive Vice President and the Chief Operating Officer here. And I'm filling in for Mike Swetnam, our CEO and Chairman of the Board. Had a major dental issue that he's getting taken care of, and hopefully will join us at the end. And General Gray also had is driving back from a war gaming at Quantico and will probably join us at the end. And this is a very important topic, obviously. And, you know, you can't pick up a paper, you can't turn on the television without reading something about cyber and being scared. You also can't, you know, swing a dead cat without hitting someone who claims to be an expert on cyber. Well, I'm here to tell you I'm not one of those people. But at the table, we do have a very distinguished panel who have been thinking about this and I think have really some important things to say to inform the debate. So I'm looking forward to listening to it. Again, it's always good to have Ben back, one of our senior fellows, and of course, Ambassador David Smith, who whenever we can get him out of Georgia, not Atlanta, the real Georgia, and back, we're always glad to have him into the rest of our panel. So being a proclaimed amateur in cyber, I'm going to sit down. Please have something to eat, and please enjoy the comments from our panel, and I know particularly we'll look forward to the question and answer period. Dave?
Tom, thank you very much, and thanks for standing in on such short notice for our CEO, Mike Swetnam, who's apparently cracked a tooth. If you've ever done that, you know why he isn't here at the podium ready to say hello to everybody, but maybe he'll come in at the end, as well as General Gray, the 29th Commandant of the Marine Corps. The chairman of our Board of Regents is on his way back from Quantico, so we hope he may be here to be able to say a few words. The way this is going to be a little bit different from our usual format. Ben has 4 scenarios to present, so what we're going to do is we're going to run this as sort of scenario and comment from our commentators, and then move on to the next scenario, and then and go to a Q&A and discussion at the end of the presentation, and Ben will give you a little bit more on exactly how we're going to do this. Well, Ben Shepherd and I have been friends for a long, long time. I kept this hidden from you, Ben. I don't know if you noticed it. Do you remember this? Yeah. This is a book that he and I worked on together in 1999. A mutual friend, Duncan Lennox, called up and said, "You have to meet this brilliant young man named Ben Shepherd." He's still a brilliant young man, because if he's not, it makes me really old. Anyway, Ben is a senior fellow here at Potomac Institute. He's also senior associate at the Institute for Alternative Futures, and he's a lecturer at George Washington University. He's a affiliated member of the University of Maryland Center for Health and Risk Communication. He does a lot of work on wargaming, has customers in the United Kingdom, the pharmaceutical industry, the Department of Homeland Security. I remember working with Ben when he was just starting to work on these political and psychological consequences of terrorism, on which he actually wrote a book. He has 2, I guess, a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Aberystwyth, and a PhD from King's College London. So he'll be doing the major presenting. This is mostly his work, and we're here just to sort of opine. But to his left is another friend of long standing who spent 16 years in the CIA, Ron Marks. I met Ron when he wandered in then after some years in the CIA. I guess had been the CIA liaison in the United States Senate, and then turned up on the staff of Senator Bob Dole, which is, I guess, at which point I met him, and we've stayed in touch throughout the years. He's also written a book, Spying in America in the Post 9/11 World, particularly relevant, I think, to some of the things that are going on now. And I also had another opportunity to work with Ron, again, just very, very recently. We published a book here at Potomac Institute, jointly with Battelle, called CyberDoc, No Borders, No Boundaries. And it never would have happened without Ron, because he had to edit the whole thing, wrote a couple of chapters himself, and straightened out people. Yes, you're right. You can't swing a dead cat. Now, I have to go back to Tom O'Leary and ask why one would want to swing a dead cat. But if one were going to, you would hit someone who has something to do with Georgia. In my case, working in Georgia, the country, not the state. But the gentleman on our far left comes from Georgia, the state, not the country, from Georgia Tech. Dr. Fred Wright. He's Chief Engineer and Associate Laboratory Director at the Cyber Technology and Information Security Laboratory at the Georgia Tech Research Institute. Now, they focus on taking cutting-edge technology and turning them into real, applicable commercial and military systems. And so in a sense, we kind of have a nexus there, because they're trying to take cutting-edge technologies and turn them into something you can actually use. And what we do here at Potomac is we try to take those cutting-edge technologies and talk about policy. What do you want? Because once you create this thing, you're going to have some kind of ethics and law and policies on how you're going to use it. So this could be a very, very interesting thing today. He's been the chair of the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, Aerospace and Electronic Systems Society panel, cybersecurity advisor for Hungry Hungry Hackers. He has a Bachelor of Science degree from Memphis State University and a master's degree and a PhD from, guess where? Georgia Tech. So with that, I'm going to look forward to the whole thing. I will simply be the moderator, which means everybody please don't take too long in your presentation or your comments, or I will whack you with this book that's now 14 years old. And with that, I'll ask Dr. Ben Shepard to make his presentation.
Well, thank you, Dave, for your warm welcome comments, introductions. And it's great to share the panel with Fred and Ron for this afternoon, and to have you here for this session. So what I'm going to do before we set up with going through the scenarios is to run through some of the background to what the methodology we're doing and why we are looking to use this particular approach. Now, cybersecurity and hardware hacking threatens to devastate societal and economic consequences. Well, so we often hear about, read about, and yes, there have been some significant attacks on various different institutions, but where might this end up going to over the next couple of years? What do we need to start thinking about now to try and better plan ahead over the next decade and beyond? So while we have a number of real concrete ideas that have been talked about in many different forums in our prism here, but what is it that we haven't thought about, both in the risks and the opportunities that we are presented with? So given the complex nature of the cyber and hardware hacking environment, and by hardware hacking I mean where you have critical circuitry components which are compromised either during manufacturing, the supply chain, or maintenance designed to fail for whatever reason, what are those different complex and uncertainty features that we're going to be having to deal with, and how can we best develop some good, robust tools to get a better grip with what we're dealing with here? Now, there are various different scenario methodologies. No doubt some of you are quite familiar with some of them. The important thing is that we're not looking to predict the future today or with any scenarios. Okay, we can try and anticipate and explore various different eventualities, but they're not predictive, but they can help to maybe anticipate and frame the discussions. And that's a real key thing, to frame the discussions. Now, the approach which we're going to run through today is something called the aspirational futures. And this was developed at the Institute of Alternative Futures back in the early 70s by Alvin Toffler and Clem Bezold, some of the leading futurists in the field, particularly during the 70s when this institute was formed. And the idea behind this is that to say when we try and reach out into the future, we have three different zones that we ideally need to consider. First of all, we have the zone of conventional expectations, essentially the trends of today and how that carries through into the future, or sometimes called the official future. The second one is a zone of growing desperation. And we often read about, well, what disasters might happen, real negative environment, skies falling in, it's going to get worse. You know, and that's been very typical of the cyber environment recently. You know, the cyber Pearl Harbor attack is upon us. That could happen at any time. And that's, you know, plenty written there. But there's a third aspect which is really intriguing, and that is a zone of high aspiration. What might a surprisingly successful strategy look like? A credible one, but it's still successful. Because we need to understand what are those events that may occur and the opportunities that we need to be able to grasp and say, yes, this can take us to a better environment, rather than being focused purely down into the area of growing desperation. Now, all three are very important. It's also equally important to have a good grip of the desperation environment of if we are presented with serious challenges, what should we try and do? But we shouldn't omit the aspirational front, to try and what is it we're trying to reach for and create, to frame the preferred future for us. So there's four scenarios we're going to run through for today. One on the conventional expectations, second on the growing desperation, and then two on the zone of high aspiration. Okay. One is more focusing on technology. The second is looking at more on the societal components. And for all of those, this has been part of kind of horizon scanning, looking at social, technological, economic, environmental, political variables. And this is still kind of an ongoing project that we've been doing at the Institute for Alternative Futures. So your comments today will be greatly received in terms of helping to enrich this process as we sort of take it further forward. So feel free to add to, critique the scenarios as we go forward, and I welcome the same from the panelists as well as we go through these next few scenarios. Now, the scenarios, if you look at one final point before I start, is that we're looking at 10 years today to 2023. You can reach out further, 20, 30 years. The advantage by looking at a further out field is that you can then say what might seem implausible, say the next 4 years, may help to be seen more plausible in the longer term future. Because how often have we been caught out thinking, well, we weren't expecting that to happen. Okay. And by stretching ourselves out a bit further, we can then have a more freedom to think about different ideas, concepts, developments, events, challenges, and through that. Because those things we may think about 10 or even 15 years down the line may actually occur a lot sooner. And if they do, we can say, we thought about that, this is what we can potentially do for that. Okay. So start off with the first scenario called the expectable scenario. The cyber defenders become virtual real-world terrorists. So disgruntled IT professionals were made unemployed by the continuing economic malaise in Europe and North America, and they banded together in 2013 through online forums to take revenge on the capitalist system that they felt had let them down. It cost them livelihoods, while senior executives were still rewarding themselves with record high pay and bonuses. By 2014, radical elements of the Occupy movements of 2011 and 12 established an online social revolutionary group called Exoso. Exoso hacked into various media sites of New York Times, Le Monde and BBC to post their manifesto stating that they wanted economic equality and greater constraints on the financial sectors, which had so far had failed in their eyes. Greece's ejection from the euro in early 2014 helped to precipitate a deep recession in Europe, and with it, support for Exoso rose on the continent. Germany and Italy's prior experience of social revolutionary groups in the 1960s both made them ripe for their revival. Exoso tapped into the malaise and helped to recruit a large cadre of followers. Now, failing European economies, including Greece, Italy, and Spain, lacked the public funds to fend off cyber attacks and to invest properly in cyber security. Critical online services like national health and welfare sites went down for days, if not sometimes for weeks, brought down by hackers. Tax systems were also temporarily crippled, leading to a reduction in tax receipts in these countries. Even the US Veteran Affairs and Social Security payments were disrupted in 2014 as systems were attacked, delaying the distribution of Social Security checks. The rise of Exoso was accompanied by cyber criminals in 2014-15 accelerating their attacks under the anonymous banner to steal credit card details from major banks. Bank customers of May Finance and Avidel were worst hit with credit card details posted on BitTorrent sites, allowing people to freely download extensive amounts of funds, with $1.3 million emptied from people's accounts over a 3-day intensive period. Exoso recruited a number of people, including reformed ex-hackers, who are now switching back from the private security firms, returning to their hacking origins, this time in support of the online social revolutionary cause. By 2015, the re-emergence of social revolutionary groups saw like N17 in Greece, Red Army faction in Germany, and with it, virtual terrorism was becoming real terrorism, as groups began a limited bombing campaign against leading bankers and politicians across several European countries. The deep recession that hit Latin America in 2017 to 18, a region with a long social revolutionary group's history, further galvanized support for Exoso. The economic success in Brazil and other countries started to turn sour. So the transnational social revolutionary movement developed transcending borders, capitalizing the world's economic malaise, and talked about as superseding what Al-Qaeda threats had been done from a decade earlier. By 2020, the 2010s were seen as a lost decade, as cycles of recession and economic malaise. The underlying contribution of the cyber attacks continued to plague economies as successive politicians failed to address their financial problems. So-called cyber Robin Hood hackers positioned themselves as the champions of people's cause and helped to bring governments and companies to account. The lack of public and private funds curtailed the ability of institutions to successfully defend themselves from the cyber attacks. It was not until the gradual return of economic boom, sustained growth in 2021, that the attacks subsided, and governments were able to regain, finally, stability in the virtual world.
And I must say, 5 minutes exactly, Ben. Great, thank you. And that's not the worst scenario. It's going to get worse. I would just note, before passing it on to our commentators, you know, if you look at some of the rhetoric coming out of Anonymous and Snowden and whatnot, this notion that sort of we are responsible for some kind of of ethics or whatever out there. I mean, that's already starting. So this is not an incredible piece. So with that, some brief comments from maybe Ron Marks first.
Sure. One of the things that he did not include in my background was I started off as a case officer at the Central Intelligence Agency. And I was very influenced and had worked for a number of years for Robert Gates, who once had a quote that anytime he smelled roses, he was looking for the funeral. So on that basis, I must admit I'm about to violate that rule by being fairly optimistic on this issue. Let me just run a couple of things down, and then maybe we can kick it around a little bit, and we'll certainly seed on that. Number one is the world is about a $65 to $70 trillion economy, and we're about 15 trillion of it, plus or minus. So when I see these attacks, or I see the scenarios for the attacks, I always sort of sit there and go, well, what level are we talking about here? Are we talking about fluff? And by fluff, I mean somebody putting something nasty on a website somewhere, or somebody, closing it down for a day or so? Are we talking about somebody essentially doing what they did in Saudi Arabia, which is putting something in the systems, or Iran for that matter, putting something in the systems and really damaging them? But again, one system, two systems. Or are we really talking about an existential threat? Now, I don't know about existential threats yet. By existential threats for you young people out there, that's what happens when 1,500 ICBMs get released from Russia, and we've got about 15 minutes to figure out what to do about it. So I don't see that level yet. Now, keep in mind, we're early in the game here. My biggest concern about cyber right now lies in the fact that, ultimately we're only about 5 to 7 years into this game. Yeah, I know we've had it around for years, and we can sort of play with Amazon and all the rest of it. But if you really look at it from about 7, 8 years ago, we've started to switch over into this thing being a international public utility. We haven't quite come to grips with that yet, and all of the implications that that means. So there's a part of me that says, okay, fine, they could muck with the system at this point. There's also a part of me that hears this and says we're living in, poor guy, I don't mean to pick you apart. We're also living in a system in which the government is not helpless. The governments are not helpless. Now, I'm not saying government, nation states are as powerful as they used to be. We all know that's not the case. Anonymous and the lulls in their own way have a delightful way of having a form of asymmetric warfare, which we're still trying to come to grips with. On the other hand, I will say one thing for our brother Snowden, is he's certainly laid out very clearly at this point that the United States government, among others, and GCHQ as of this morning, heaven only knows who else, aren't exactly sitting around waiting for the mushrooms to grow. I mean, they have, in fact, many systems and many methodologies by which they can engage to counter this stuff. The other assumption that's being made right now is one of attribution. It's a hell of a system. Anybody who's followed the development of the internet knows, there's always some graphic representation of it, which, looks like an exploding set of nerves in the human body. But it's huge. The railway by which it operates, if I can, I won't use the word tubes. The senator did that and got in trouble. The internet, the material that is stored on the internet, cyberspace, the communication of that is huge. I mean, it just keeps on growing. So I don't know what the implications are for attribution at this point. But I will say to you that my estimation right now is that we're getting a hell of a lot better than we used to be. So every time I see a lull attack and I see kids getting rolled up in about 4 to 6 weeks afterwards, I'm not saying that they can't engage in the initial bombing or the initial activity. But this is not what it was 7 or 8 years ago by a long shot. Now, we're getting into a lot of what I would call dude terrorism right now, okay? Now, for those of us who are older, by dudes, I mean like those guys up in Boston, the let's hang out and convert ourselves kind of guys. These are dudes. They hang out at the gym, they go around with their buddies, they have a drink, and then 1 or 2 of them get convinced because they're bored out of their mind in a cause, whatever that may be. I don't know how you deal with that. But I think, all things considered, I would not consider the 2010s a lost decade. Now, is this stuff going to increase? The answer is probably yes. Is it going to be a threat of some kind? I think it's going to be a bit of a pain in the ass and a drag on the system. But I'm not so sure altogether that's going to do all that much damage. And let me shut up.
Okay, let's hear from Fred Wright.
All right, thanks. We think about these scenarios, and this first one in particular, and then some of the things that will come up in the later scenarios. I think cyberspace, in terms of what we do with it, what matters in cyberspace kind of falls into three categories. Sort of the social, cyber social, just the way to interact with other people, families across international borders. Perhaps the most important is it provides lanes of commerce these days. Google has been worth more than GM for a while now, for example. And certainly this scenario focuses on financial, economic issues as part of a motivator. And then the last part, I think, that where cyberspace really matters is kind of the cyber physical, where cyberspace is used, networks are used to control physical processes, whether it's electrical energy or the list goes on if you think about it. And those are all important areas to think about and have different implications for sure. In this scenario, it starts out with IT professionals being disgruntled because they're underemployed. That's a big turnaround from today. Of course, IT professionals is a wide swath of people with different levels of expertise and capability, but not many people who have real IT expertise or abilities have much trouble finding work these days. So things must be really bad if we start to have those people get disgruntled. That's one of my thoughts about the scenario. But then I started to think, okay, well, a lot of the really great cyber type people, very talented type, people, and some of them kind of underground, but the good guys even, they have a certain loyalty to this notion of the internet. They have a certain idealistic and purist view of the internet and its use. Some of them can be fairly not only want a clean internet and a kind internet, but one that's not maybe free of money, but free perhaps of profit even. So there are all sorts of people with different kinds of notions who are very talented, and it wouldn't take a huge number of disgruntled IT people, but even a small handful, as we've even seen in the last few years, can make a big difference and have a big splash. The question is, can they have a big splash on our economic foundations and really add to economic problems? I think in the sense that if they are turned and become sour and still are insiders, still have the keys to the kingdom of companies that they may have worked for, ways to get in, then there's a lot that could be very believable from that point of view.
Okay, Ben, let's go on with number 2. And because it's going to get worse, right?
So this is the second scenario from the zone of growing desperation.
This is the worst, right?
This is
the bad one. Okay.
Then it gets better after this. So in April 2014, pesticide plants in New Jersey had their control rooms hacked into, forcing the release of significant amounts of toxic gas over the areas. It was estimated that about 2,400 ultimately died from the attacks, with 9,000 being injured. 3 days later, some nuclear power plants in California were attacked, with reactors taken offline, creating significant radiation leaks. The intelligence communities believed that the perpetrators of the cyber attacks were actually conducted by Iran, and they thought it was in response to the US significant cyber attacks on Iran only a couple of months earlier. As a result, the US initiated hostilities against Iran. However, several months later, after going through all the intelligence information, it transpired that it was not Iran who was responsible for their cyber attacks, But the trace was pulled all the way back to a new religious cult group called the Party of Heaven, a group who was found to be located in Venezuela, so it was thought. It turned out that the Party of Heaven had actually hacked into and stolen China's cyber warfare programs, and armed with this arsenal, was launching a series of waves of attacks. China began a limited cooperation with the US to try and mitigate further attacks, but it was too late. In July 2015, the US Federal Reserve Automated Clearinghouse in New York that processes just under $80 billion a day was attacked. Data corrupted, and market and public confidence in the US banking system pretty almost collapsed. On August 12, 2015, the US President, in the primetime television address, informed the nation that the US was now fighting World War III. But when World War III started was unclear. It turned out that China's codes were not stolen. The cyber attacks on industry and government that accelerated during the 2000s were not largely random criminal activists, but part of a larger coordinated effort by Iran, Russia, and China. Indeed, they had used these so-called criminal activities to try and probe and test the West's defenses. And their views was trying to ultimately change the West's dominance in international affairs. Iran's creation of its own internal internet in 2012 was part of a defense strategy for what it saw as part of the coming war. The Stuxnet and Flame attacks on Iran in the early 2010s were allowed to happen by Tehran to test the offensive capabilities of the US from its cyber fronts. World War III therefore began almost 10 years earlier, but the West did not realize this until 2015. By 2017, it was clear that the US cyber attack strategies were failing. The West was losing World War III. Only the mashing of neuroscience with cyber to immerse individuals into the cyber environment around 2018 provided some glimmer of hope to stem the tide. And this provided a whole series of new frontiers to which to work on. The darkest hour came on June the 13th, 2019, when hacking group CQA announced that it would execute 26,000 Americans and Western Europeans at noon Eastern Time the following day. In the early afternoon of June the 14th, emergency rooms around the US and Europe reported a surge in heart attack patients. Pacemakers and remote heart monitoring systems previously celebrated as providing effective cardiac care were now turned into weapons. The group had hacked into and disrupted monitors with fatal consequences and mass heart attacks at almost an instant. The day will become known as Black Heart.
Right. How about we start with some brief comments this time? Let's reverse the order and go to Fred Wright first.
So this scenario gets to the cyber physical attacks and discusses World War III taking place largely on networks. We see also in this scenario something that was alluded to by Ron in the last discussion, which gets to attribution and a misunderstanding of the situation with not sure who is behind what, and by the time it's discovered, a lot of water under the bridge and a lot of missed opportunities. If we're trying to think, particularly for this desperation scenario, if we're trying to think about are these things possible first? And then secondly, to the extent these kinds of attacks are possible, what should we be doing to mitigate the likelihood and risk and so forth? Let me start by considering the last part, the attack on medical devices. I'll kind of broaden it to not just the heart, but lots of other medical devices that might be at risk, being a cyber-physical type of system. As we look to the future, developing systems, not only the medical devices, but the information systems that support them, databases and the networks and so forth, using the approach of grabbing the initiative, getting products into market quickly, and using existing protocols and so forth. One of the things we got to look at is securing those and looking at vectors and what are those threat vectors versus what are the risk and what are the likelihoods. I think that a mass attack across medical devices in different hospitals in different places would be unlikely to be successful, largely not because there's lots of security in place, but because networks are heterogeneous and the time it would take to get into all these different places in order to have that kind of impact on a mass scale would be difficult to pull off. Nonetheless, even on a small scale, it's certainly something we certainly have to think about. In terms of the attribution, there have been a number of people in the last number of years, I'd say the last 3 years, that have tried to look at new ways of managing identity across the internet for not only secure systems, to protect companies, but also individuals. And how can we manage that? Clearly, our certification authorities, CAs, that were developed some years ago as part of the Netscape development is broken, and we've seen a number of certificate authorities hacked and so forth. So we've got to look at, I think, and there are some interesting ideas out there. How do we manage identities? How do we manage identities for ourselves and our devices personally, companies, governments, as a key to better attribution for the future?
Great. Now some brief remarks from Ron Marks.
Yeah, at the 1 minute mark, you can hold up a finger to indicate. I'll let you to figure out which finger you want to hold up. Yeah, let me take it on a slightly broader level. I'm looking at a friend of mine back here in the room here who was involved with the SEALs for a while, and I'm thinking about low-intensity conflict. Make no mistake about it, we're sort of at war right now anyway. This is low-intensity conflict, and the definition of that pretty much is whatever you want it to be, but let's face it, we are engaged pretty much on a daily basis now with either China or Iran or Anonymous, the lulls, etc. And they're probing, and we're trying to find what they're probing, etc. And you've seen all this stuff from Snowden, etc., who's provided us just a wonderful set of lectures on the subject. There is a learning curve here, and it is what I always fear with scenarios is that there is no input to a learning curve. We don't sit here stupidly and take it. We do things to harden systems. Now, whether or not that's successful is something else altogether. My greatest insight lies not into the hospital industry, but in the financial industry, where an enormous amount of redundancy has been put into the system. An enormous amount of increased security has been put into the system. Now, look, I'm an old operations guy, and I used to recruit people for a living, okay? In fact, there's nothing in the world I would love more than a disgruntled 26-year-old who happened to have access to codes. And by the way, make no mistake about it. What these guys are right now, what sysop guys are the code breakers. They're the code carriers, rather. You want them. Why? Because you can read into the system, or alternatively, they can tell you who's involved with the system. But we also know that. The question, again, is how this system gets hardened over time. And I don't think we're going to be sitting around waiting for systems to be hardened when somebody attacks them. We are doing some of this stuff in advance. In fact, Silicon Valley is doing a very good job of making a lot of money on it. How successful they are is something else altogether. I am more worried, frankly, about the insider threat than I am about external threat. I think you can have systems probed, they can muck things up. I quite agree with you on the hospitals. I mean, some of my experience at GW Homeland Institute, I've listened to enough of these lectures now, the hospital systems, whether they wish to be that way or not, are slightly disorganized enough that they're not speaking to each other. Although I could pick a couple of people whom I would not mind having their pacemakers stopped. You know, the fact of the matter is that that is a scenario in extremes, and not a bad one. I mean, I think you make a good point when you do that, but let me suggest to you that, you know, the blackest scenario here still represents a shutting down of a system for which there may well be some redundancies. Even if we shut down the internet now, there's another system out there called the telecommunications system that we can use. Is it preferable? No. Will it get overloaded? Probably. Anybody been around here during that derecho? Guess what? Phone systems blew out. Tech systems didn't. What can I say? The worst part about any kind of battle scenario for this, I think I'm getting close to the end here, is very simply that it can be used to blind us and kick us hard at a bad point in time. That I agree with. I think that you have to be careful of. But when you, again, I'll go back to the ability to win a battle or to engage in existential threat. They can hurt us, but they can't kill us yet. And I don't see that system developing anytime soon. But again, the systems have developed quickly, so you still don't know. There, I was nice at the end.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, well, Ben's taken us through, I think, limbo and the ninth circle of hell. Now we're going to ascend, and he's going to give us some happy news, yes?
Partly, yes. Yes.
We can be saved. And don't mess with Jersey, all right?
Okay, so these next two are the aspirational scenarios, and we'll do the same. We'll do each scenario in turn, followed by a discussion. As part of the aspirational scenarios, it may take a major dire event, first of all, before you can reach a surprisingly successful strategy, before we get there at the end of the day. The rise of cyber attacks, combined with the 2013 budget and healthcare crisis in Europe and North America, reinforced the narrative that government institutions were unable to tackle critical issues. Nation-states became increasingly powerless in controlling monetary policy, organizing production, and providing social benefits. Commentators coined this the rise of the powerless state. In 2014, Phoenix, a citizen online network group comprised of computer programmers and anonymous senior company information officers, decided the internet must be replaced for two reasons. First, they believed that nation-states could no longer be relied upon as partners to provide the legislative environment, resources, and coordination to combat cyber and hardware attacks. Second, the traditional web could not be repaired. Phoenix sought not just a new web, but a new way of running the web. User access to knowledge and collaboration on the new web was earned, not a given right. And to encourage the best and the brightest wisdom and deter malicious intentions, Phoenix established the Wise Council of Web Guardians. The Guardians designed a self-policing model containing a series of higher concentric rings, where users would be based on what and how they contributed and engaged with the new web were rewarded with higher access. The top rings were wisdom. By 2015, the extensive task of designing and wiring a new web began with citizens building their own networks. The new web developed a new internet protocol system ensuring that non-compliant devices could not connect and to keep infections out. The old Wild Web still existed, but unlike the old web, which cannot clearly differentiate who was connecting, whether they're intended to perturb the net, and the automated protocols guarded and facilitated the new web's hierarchical system. Advances in 3D printers and the development of hardware printers provided communities with their technological capabilities and know-how to build the new web. By 2017, hardware printers were able to provide the core ground-based circuitry to develop and maintain the web. A printer that printed a hardware printer from the ground up was rolled out and invented and seen as very robust. There too was the invention of the cyber wand that allowed consumers to wave a device over their systems to detect compromised circuitry. This boosted public confidence in the new network and in home-based setups. The new net was fed through ground-based circuitry comprising a series of elements of electricity pylons, new satellites launched in 2018 funded by philanthropists. Cyber criminals attempted to hack into and release the viruses, but the concentric rings of the new web meant that automatic security algorithms contained and removed the malicious programs with a great degree of success. And those who were looking to try and release malicious codes were therefore kept down at the lower concentric rings. The rollout of the new internet was accompanied by the fruition of self-wiring microchips that hit the market in 2018. Initially developed around the 2012 era, the components were capable of doing different jobs from a transistor to a diode. And they work by exposing special negatively and positively charged particles that causes the charged particles to be shifted around and reconfigured. The disruptive technology dramatically reduced the size and the cost of elementary components, and with it, the cost of computing devices. Those with legacy systems designed for the old internet could install the self-wiring microchips that could convert devices from the traditional net to work on the new network with great safety and reliance. The success and robustness of the governance structures that form the architecture of the new internet, with citizen councils and regional policy developments, were viewed as a framework to extend in a whole lot of new domains. The high levels of cooperation and governments at a global level above the nation state showed how supranational networks can overcome constraints of the nation-state system to address the legitimacy crisis of governance institutions.
Great. Let's go back to our first order and ask Ron Marks to go first this time.
Oh boy, now I get to be cranky.
This was the good one.
I know, and that's why I'm a deliberate contrarian. Couple of things about this. The net, as you all know, was not built to do what it's doing right now. I mean, this always fascinates me. I belong to the Cosmos Club, and Vin Cerf is one of the members there. And of course, he was one of the original guys around with ARPA, where these guys basically set up in that nice sort of 1960s hippy-dippy kind of way that we're going to share all these information and all the rest of it and the security aspect of this thing. Well, you know, we trust our colleagues. Again, I'll go back to the public utility aspect of this thing. This thing was never designed to do what it's doing right now, which is exchanging billions of dollars, trillions of dollars worth of commerce, information, etc. So the idea of actually producing another internet or hardening that net, certainly producing another internet, I think Mike McConnell, in fact, a couple of years ago had come up or had discussed the idea. This was back in the old days when Mike was still talking about cyber Pearl Harbors. Did he realize that, in fact, his people were going to be the one committing the cyber Pearl Harbor? I'm not sure. Nevertheless, you can harden this system. I think one of the challenges of the internet right now is that, you know, and again, dominated by private industry, it tends to be done not illogically on a profit basis. I got a buddy of mine who is, and you know, it's all former CIA guys try to find, you know, employment afterwards. When they end up either at banks or at companies as chief security officer. Somehow I've escaped that so far. So I got a buddy of mine that is a chief security officer at a major financial institution, probably the second or third largest in the country. Now he's also in charge of IT security there. Here's his problem. He is what is delightfully referred to as a cost center. Now, when he goes into his chief executive officer and says, "Hey, I'd like to spend another $300 million, shoring up our system here," the CEO takes one look at him, goes cross-eyed, and said, "Can you do it for 150?" And I'm not being flip about that. This is very simply a risk management exercise for these guys, which is how much money can we spend on this thing to prevent, say, 90% of the problem. Or let me put it another way. Once upon a time, there was a company called, let's see, I think it was General Motors. They put something out called the Corvair, a lousy car. They would cost about $300 million at the time to fix it up. They figured they were going to get $150 million worth of lawsuits. So what would you do? The cheapness of how we do security in that system has left us reasonably vulnerable. One of the things that we've been mincing around about at this point is to what kind of regulation or what kind of requirement do we put on this. Now, let me finish off with one last thought as well, which is I want everybody in this room who has updated their security system in the last couple of days or last week to raise your hand. A couple, they're very nice. The rest of you, dangerous people, for whom about 80% of the security matters in this internet of ours occur, we've got ourselves a problem here. Whether or not we should require the ISPs to sit there and require you to update so that you cannot access this system is another question, at least until you update your security. And my final comment would be I always am very skeptical when it comes to people's altruistic motives. I understand why certain people would, but for the most part, people are driven either by greed or by profit. If it is positive for them to do so, they will do so. So I really don't see much of a scenario in terms of that kind of positive. What I do see are people being persuaded either through tax incentive or other profitability motives or other personal motives in which you have a government, which, by the way, will still have power, to either make them do this or somehow penalize them for not doing it.
Fred.
All right. This is one I'll have to restrain myself a little bit on because I think I got a lot of thoughts on this particular scenario. But what I want to focus on is what are the impediments to getting to this new internet, whatever that might mean. And I think it probably doesn't mean a new physical infrastructure, but maybe a new logical infrastructure and policy infrastructure, guidance infrastructure. I think there are a number of things that would preclude a new internet from popping up very quickly. One is that standards bodies would need to work very fast and get things done so that the networks could be built in the scenario that was described by individuals and companies and so forth. And standards bodies move slow. They just do. So that's certainly one piece. And there are lots of standard bodies already working around the world on all kinds of communications and infrastructure and protocols and so forth. So that's one issue I think we have to look at. In the beginning of the internet, there were no standards bodies much. It came together and kind of exploded from there, as Ron described. What's the current state of security, cybersecurity? The current state is we've got lots of companies doing a widget here, a piece there, an application here, an idea there, and then companies and governments are left to pick the apples and oranges and try to integrate those things into existing enterprises. So there's a lot of appeal to let's just leave all that and jump to the new internet where all that stuff is just built in. How do you get from point A to point B with the hodgepodge of security technologies that are out there? I think that's an issue. Picking the best of breeds and then folding those into new standards will be a real challenge. I guess one other idea is that one of the issues I think that we have in security in general is what I call an innovation gap. Somebody comes up with a new idea of how to secure something, it gets bought up by a big company, or they start a company and they're cranking the money out, and then before long it's less effective and less effective and less effective, and there's not much incentive to add new innovation because they're still turning the money crank and making the profits. And then some other guy, young guy, whatever, comes up with a new idea and the process starts over, but that leaves us in an innovation gap relative to where attackers are. So that, I think that's another one of the things that in this scenario we'd have to consider how to overcome and how to incentivize those innovations.
Great, thanks for the comments. And Ben, on to the final one.
So this is the second aspirational scenario and the final of the four for this afternoon. "336 people died, including 83 on the ground, when a passenger jet crashed in August 13, 2014 while approaching LA airport. Several days later, an Air Zero flight approaching Chicago O'Hare also crashed in similar poor visibility conditions, where both aircraft were flying on instruments. AQAP claimed responsibility for both crashes, claimed that they had compromised components of the navigation systems and that other aircraft were infected. The extended time required to check the critical aircraft components and the uncertainty surrounding what other components may be compromised fueled public fears over aviation safety. The attacks facilitated a value shift among the public that a perceived lack of action against cyber and hardware hacking was now costing not just a loss of data, but lives. Public revulsion at the attacks and political stalemate led to the birth of Protest Security Group, or #ProSec, in 2015, an international hacktivist protest group with the purpose of naming and punishing companies who fail to protect their privacy and safety. Soon after, a more radical group called Cybax emerged to devastate organizations listed on a publicly voted target list online. Companies were shunned and destroyed. Consumers became the collateral fallout, and people laid off as companies crashed. The intelligence community struggled to stop the war despite the powers available from treating Cybax and others as terrorist groups. However, out of the cyber chaos emerged a new Cyber Values Group, a business consortium established in 2016 by financial firm CapEx, then Air Zero, and technology group Texo. New Cyber Values Group warned the business sector that unless they changed their approach to cyber, any business could be attacked and forced into bankruptcy in this anarchic world. In 2017, a Small Business Administration took the controversial step of partnering with New Cyber Values to address the concerns of its members, realizing that small businesses in particular were very much vulnerable to cyber attacks and more challenging for them to recover. The Small Business Administration championed wider US government uptake of its strategy. With Cybax destroying businesses, alternative strategies had to be seen to be taken forward. A new elected President Nora announced that her backing for what the Small Business Administration was doing. In 2018, President Nora created a hybrid government citizen-led department called Cybervision, jointly run by businesses, citizen groups, and government. The idea is trying to unify the cyber architecture and policies under one roof. Cyber warriors were created to harness civilians and businesses to identify and defend against attacks. With low public and company trust in some of the intelligence communities from failing to prevent major attacks, and concerns from companies in sharing their data with the intel community due to privacy aspects, they were looking for a more accountable and a transparent group to try and engage with. And this particular group, Cybervision, provided this particular way forward in their views, with social, economic, and national security responsibilities at its heart, but equipped with extensive powers to make sweeping changes. Indeed, Cybervision, towards the end of the 2010s, was becoming so successful in actually reducing the amount of cyber attacks and helping businesses to really improve their resiliency that it was seen as a successful model for other countries to follow. And they too themselves created their own variants and versions of this entity. By 2019, Cybervision opened backdoor discussions with Cybax and Prosec to successfully arrange a ceasefire that involved the creation of cyber safe havens, whereby companies agreed to strict cyber protection protocols in return to not be attacked. In 2020, the US government and the European Union controversially incorporated parts of the Cybax Peace Accord into their cyber legislation. Brussels gave immunity to prosecution for 13 Cybax leaders in return for them to lay down their cyber arms and to help them to implement and design the new EU legislation. The EU recruited additional Cybax hacktivists to join the cyber fight. Poachers became gamekeepers. Companies clamored to meet the strict entry requirements to go into the cyber safe haven. It took a cyber terrorist group to force industry and governments into a value shift, bringing commerce back to life from cyber anarchy. Indeed, a terrorist manifesto had formed the basis of cyber best practices.
Great. Let's reverse the order again and start with Fred.
One of the things that I think about with this scenario is, especially the last little paragraph there where it talks about cyber terrorists forcing industry and governments to do the right thing finally, maybe not quite the right word, but shift values. I think one of the issues we have with a lot of the cyberspace issues is that we don't have good visuals. One of the quotes that I like to use when I'm introducing cyber topics and courses and things is a CEO or CIO of a large company talking about how that in order for us to start taking cybersecurity seriously, then we need to have a BP oil spill of data. And I keep thinking to myself, haven't we had that for the last 10 years? And I don't think it's quite working. The point being that with an oil spill, you can see the little waterfowl out on the shore, all covered with goop, and you feel real, bad in your heart. But when data leaks out of the country or out of your company, well, the CFO cares when he starts seeing the bottom line tilt, and the public relations officers certainly care when they have to answer embarrassing questions in front of microphones. But the beginning of this scenario starts with cyber physical attacks, in this particular case against aviation. And I think when we start seeing those kinds of things, if we do, more of those kinds of things, I should say, then people will start to get concerned for sure. The question is, how will that cause this kind of a scenario to take place? Would that really cause industry and governments to shift values? Certainly the industry that's hit will shift, but would that be a large-scale thing to go to the basic guidance and infrastructure of the way we do business on the internet? Not too sure. Clearly, when you look at the technologies needed for securing and protecting against cyber terrorism, lots of things come to play. So pulling all those together with this cyber vision consortium of government and industry and so forth, kind of hard to see how that would all come together similar to the last scenario.
Ron?
Sure. Let me start at the macro, because you hit on a good point toward the end here. Let me just sort of work my way back down. And of course, like all good Americans, let me speak strictly about the United States, because we are the center of the universe. Here's the thing. When I teach cyber, or I teach intelligence or whatever else back, when I can inflict myself on students like at NDU or at GW or whatever else, I always like to start off talking about the American Constitution. The American Constitution is a wondrous document because it tells us pretty much who we are. Everybody gets hung up in the Declaration of Independence. That, frankly, was just telling George III to piss off. The United States Constitution, we mucked around after a number of years and finally came up with this one big solution. The fundamental of the United States Constitution is we don't trust government the distance we can throw it. You don't think so? You got three parts of government. You've got a judiciary, you've got a legislative, and you've got executive, all of whom counterbalance each other. By the way, you threw some states' rights in there as well, and don't forget, you've got a Bill of Rights. When you start getting into warfare and spying and things like cyber, you're starting to get into the business of having to trust government. If you don't think that that's a problem, take a look right now as the press, continues to pump out the Snowden stuff. All of a sudden, the polls are starting to go negative at this point, and poor President Obama, 2/3 of the country doesn't trust the way we're doing X, Y, and Z. There is always going to be a trust factor there. One of the ways you get around that trust factor is by trying to figure out what it is, and you, by being the government, what it is that you're doing. In this case, what I would say to you, what it is that we're doing in the cyber world. The executive order that came out with regards to how we're going to proceed on cyber, well, again, I've been here for 30 years, so guys, you young people, don't listen to this cynical old man, but let me tell you something. It reminds me of every damned EO I've ever seen come out in an interagency process that comes up with oatmeal. Everybody's going to do a little bit. And that's a problem right now. We don't have a coordinated cyber policy. We fundamentally don't have a doctrine about what it is that we care to do. Now, you notice I was going to flip in the book on the doctrine, right? Get it on Amazon. Fact of the matter is that we don't have a fundamental statement about what we wish as the United States government to do in cyberspace. And by the way, the United States government is going to take the lead on this one because there are 30 million businesses in the United States. 30 million. The vast majority of the businesses of the United States are 2, 3, 4, 5 people. And by the way, they in turn employ a huge portion of the American population, not the Fortune 500, which, by the way, is who DHS is talking to right now, and which has the maximum PR impact. So we have to decide how we're going to do this. And I couldn't agree with you more in terms of having some kind of coordinated central aspect or central control of our cyber policy in the U.S. It is a mess right now because everybody has their fingers in it. It's a new sport. But when I sit there at a rollout at Commerce Department and hear about FBI, CIA, NSA, NIST, DHS, and others involved in the process, I think to myself, I'm not quite sure where we're going here, but wherever it is, it doesn't sound like very far. That kind of centralized control over cyber, I think, would be crucial. Having a reason to do it and an understanding to do it, which includes the citizens, us, 300 million of us, 270 some odd million of us with access to the internet, 30 million businesses, most of whom have access to the internet, a United States government with some, 3 or 4 million employees, depending upon how you throw in the National Guard. You've got the largest economy in the world here that has yet to figure out quite what to do in cyberspace. And I don't think, until we do something to what you're talking about, where we actually get some coordination, get some understanding of what it is we're going to do, we're going to get any resolution of this. You'll continue to have sort of mucking around in piecemeal. I'm not sure I agree with, with all the scenarios here, but it certainly lends itself to these kind of scenarios when you don't have that kind of basic coordination.
Okay, let me say a few words, if I may, then we're going to throw it open to our audience that's been very, very patient. I mean, I kind of like the approach, and I guess I'd take, and I know you disaggregated them, and we got the official one. I'm not sure the second one isn't really more the official one. You hear more people talking about the doom and gloom and Pearl Harbors and 9/11s and all sorts of things than you do really the one you started with. But I think there's a couple of things that I would note here. First of all, the process here I think may actually be more important than the product. you know, putting out a scenario, this is what could happen, and then talking about it. Could it happen? Could it not happen? What are the strong points? What are the weak points? You know, that's kind of what we need to do, and what you've done here is filled a vacuum, because everybody in this room, I guess, you've been to other cyber conferences, and you get this sort of this doom and gloom, you know, everything will go bad, the lights will go out, the water will turn off, we're going to starve and freeze in the dark, and then things get really bad, you know, and it's sort of, and there's no way out. And I think we need to start, it becomes, you know, live, what is it, live free or die hard, you know, and the bus goes up and hits the helicopter, and I mean, it's kind of cool, but why? I mean, and then people get kind of turned off because it's kind of like, well, okay, that's nice. It was a good movie, but I mean, you know, why would you do that? You know, I mean, is the Chinese general staff sitting around thinking about stuff like that? I doubt it. They're probably thinking about something, and we better start thinking about what they're thinking about. And that's what I think is good about the scenarios. I kind of glom them all together, though, in a certain sense. I think the answer is all of the above. But one of the things that I pulled out, well, I guess a couple of things. First of all, I think Fred mentioned we're going to have a BP disaster. Well, you know, the thing is, we had the Exxon Valdez in 1989. We had that, and then we had the BP spill. So it's not clear that things necessarily fix themselves. Sometimes they do. But when there really is a sense of really urgent need, Pearl Harbor, it's bandied about all too often. Yeah, we didn't much know what we're doing. If you read the history of the first year or so of World War II, it was kind of a disaster. It really was the Keystone Cops really tripping over their own feet, with the possible exception of the Battle of Midway. But in less than 3 years, we had the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which basically established American supremacy in the Pacific from then until now. So, you know, learning is possible, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think you have to want to learn. And I think Ron made the point that in all these scenarios, we have to get the concept of some learning curve in there. That as we go through a 10-year period, okay, on period 1, somebody takes a whack at Jersey. You know, pretty quickly, I guarantee you, Jersey's going to break your face, all right? But as soon as we figure out who did it. But there has to be some kind of learning curve in there, because people won't just sit and take it. And I think one of the other things that you've done here, Ben, that is very useful is start trying to get to the who's and the whys. The first one was disgruntlement. I'm not sure you're going to get disgruntlement by unemployment, but you clearly do have the disgruntlement factor, and I'm wondering whether Ron's not right that we're entering the age of the insider. It's always been a problem. Insiders pilfering stuff out of the grocery store's refrigerator, insiders stealing client lists, but this really gives you the ability to do the insider like what Snowden allegedly did, where you can really do a lot of damage. And it seems to me that's one of the things, that there's that kind of thing. Then the other thing that I think was very, very useful that you put into this was bringing nation states into this. We have, I think, in America, a much too mechanistic view of nation states and the way they work. And you very interestingly put China and Russia and Iran. Take a look at what's going on in world politics today. Who do you see banding together? Russia and China and Iran. Not because they all love each other. They probably actually don't much like each other, but they have one common dislike, and that is what they perceive to be American dominance around the world. And they do work together. They've worked together on things like missiles. They've worked together on certain kinds of technology. And if you see what's going on right now at the so-called G8, we have another example of basically the Russians not playing our game. But then Ron added, I think, another actor that I think has to be put into this, and that is the business owner, the government acting on behalf of the business owner. And what's the motive here? It's profit. The reality is, when you go out and use your credit card this afternoon, there's going to be a certain amount of credit card fraud that goes on in your bank, in every bank in the world. And they've got a calculation of at what point is it worth them doing something about it, and at what point, below what point, is it not worth worrying about? The banks could cut it down to, you can never cut it to zero, but they could cut it down to pretty close to zero if they wanted to. The reality is they've done a residual risk calculation and they've decided not to. And it seems to me that we're going to have to start thinking about that. Eventually, when this starts costing more than those people are willing to pay, you are going to see some reactions. I think we haven't seemed to have gotten to that point yet. We're really in a state of flux here. I will hold the book up, though. I mean, you know, this is the book that Ron meant to hold up. This is the book that Ron pretty much was the coordinator on the entire thing. It was edited by Tim Sample from Battelle and Mike Swetnam, who has the broken tooth and may or may not turn up with us here today. Anyway, this was published by Potomac Institute Press. But the major theme of this book is, which came out right at the end, we need a doctrine. Now, it's not going to be easy. You don't sit down and write a doctrine. You know, I have something to say, and so I'm going to take 2 weeks. I'm going to clear my schedule and sit down and I'm going to write a doctrine. I could do that, by the way. The problem is you got to get buy-in to everybody. It's not that easy. You could, a smart person, could write something pretty good in 2 or 3 weeks. The problem is the process. It takes years. There's always a problem. Somebody's not on board. And until we really start doing that, though, we're not going to be able to deal with this except piecemeal, which is the way we're dealing with it now. So anyway, I think this was a really great effort that you started, and I think we need more of this because there's too many fantastic stories and sort of children's bedtime stories about, you know, what will happen to you if you're not good. And we need to kind of move beyond that. With that, I'd invite Ben to just stay where he is, and we'll take comments and questions here, and I'll maybe stand. We do have somebody with a microphone. It's really important that if you have a question or comment, that you speak into the microphone. And please identify yourself and your organization. And please, if you do make a comment, I'm not going to say no comments, only questions, but try and keep it pretty brief, or I will be rude. Okay? Thanks. Charlie Hymack.
Dave said, my name's Charlie Hymack. I'm a retired Air Force colonel. The one thing I miss at these conferences is someone standing up and saying, what are our core cyber worries? And I would argue that there are two at the top of the list. First one is national integrity, and the second one is power projection. And it's in the context of how can cyber attacks in concert with physical attacks, whether it be bio or nuclear or just explosives, take down the core infrastructures so that we can no longer maintain national integrity or power projection. Now, in the case of power projection, I'm not arguing against weapon systems. I'm saying it's the simple things like getting fuels to bases, attacking families, etc. But I really am talking about it the way our infrastructure is changing because of technology and because of economics. Our infrastructure is reducing to points of control. One example, Union Pacific Railroad, biggest railroad in the country. It's all operated and controlled from Omaha. If they cannot control switches from there, the railroad goes down to 10 miles an hour. I can assure you, if all the railroads went down to 10 miles an hour, you have a national integrity issue. So the question here is, shouldn't we be looking at scenarios that are address those 2 points rather than what I've seen here today?
Let me take a whack at that. You know, Colonel, as well as everybody else, that what the military did very early in the late 90s certainly was go to a form of net-centric warfare. That makes them vulnerable, and I still say at this point in time, you know, we haven't quite arrived at the state where cyber is an existential threat. What it is, if I'm going to try to clean this up ever so slightly, is if we're in a barroom fight, what it is, it's the guy who just poked you in the eye, because they're going to blind you asymmetrically first. If I'm sitting out on the Belleau Wood right now in the Pacific, and I'm worried about North Korea coming south, and it's already happened at this point, if my comms are down, if my net's down, I've got a problem. I'm going to be on a click, and I'm going to have to be sitting there trying to get it through radio traffic, which leads to the other question here, which is what are the redundancies here? I always think one of the challenges in one of these scenarios, in fact, is just that, which is that, okay, if we shut down X, what happens? What's the backup system here? If there's no backup system here, we got a headache. But what I've found is now, is it a system in that redundancy that is as good as the other one? Maybe not. But is it going to leave us completely helpless? Probably not. Is it going to leave us hurt? Or let's put it this way, someone takes advantage of us quickly, which is what you would do in the event of net-centric warfare, which is, all of a sudden that thing is down, and all of a sudden the Koreans are down the peninsula, and we can't quite react to it, or the Chinese are taking, the whole Taiwan thing. Then I think we have some trouble. But again, it goes back to, back to your initial statement, which is that the purpose of a doctrine is to have the words that you use to describe a situation and describe the strategies and the tactics from which this goes on. You and I were used to something called containment. That was done by, a fellow by the name of Kennan. I'm just reading his biography right now. He just happened to hit it at the right time. He was an old Russia expert, and everybody sort of came to agree at the right time because the Russians were acting like bastards around the world, and what he said fit that scenario. Not so sure on cyber we can quite get away with that right now. It's going to take a little bit more, in part because, again, the existential threat of 12 to 15 million Russian troops is not here. My internet is down today is not equal to we're going to lose Berlin. So that, I think that's why it's taking a little bit longer. And again, it came up on us fast, and I agree with Dave. It just takes time sometimes to develop these things.
Any of our other panelists before I...
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I think the integrity issue really goes to critical infrastructure of all kinds. And one of the difficulties I think we have in assessing where we're at in protecting our critical infrastructure is that there are experts in each of these areas. And it's hard to know if you're an expert in the electrical grid, for example, how good a shape is oil and gas in, or water, or pipelines, or the financial sector for that matter. One of the things I discovered when I was getting familiar with the power industry and how they control things and deal with things is that I discovered that an IED is not an improvised explosive device. I discovered it's an intelligent electronic device which controls substations and so forth, and is connected to various networks. There's a terminology issues, so trying to understand where are we really. I know the standards that are out there for critical infrastructure are very lacking, and people are trying to get ahead of that in both in industry and government. The other thing I would say, though, in terms of our military, I feel a little bit better about our defense and power projection in the face of cyber warfare than most of the other areas, for a couple of reasons. One is our military is built on the ideas like commander's intent and so forth, where we provide the intent, and subordinates and groups in whatever service are expected to take responsibility and make decisions based on what they have. And I think that's a very robust approach. The other part is we're always training and we're always testing, and comms are always breaking, and our folks deal with it. So not perfect, but I think we're in a little better shape there. At least that's my sense.
And just brief point. I mean, yeah, great question. I think the challenge here is, and what also is the tipping point, which we've just alluded to a bit earlier, for when you might move into the next phase and say, no, really, we need to have a strong coordination across the different bodies here. Yeah, we can trundle along and just tolerate a series of low-level attacks or this kind of attacks happening at the moment. When might that go to the next stage? What kind of event may need to happen? Or what is it that we need to try and aspire to try and prevent ourselves being forced into a tipping point before making those big decisions at the end of the day? And that's the ideal situation, is be able to delicately step-toe around the tipping point event, and so we get ahead of it rather than being forced into the situation that, okay, finally we'll do something about it.
Great. Next question is over in the corner over here.
Thanks, Tom Goldberg. Very interesting group of scenarios. What I would ask of you, if I could, is if you could elaborate more between two, the first and the second, to reflect reality, which is occurring today. I don't see this, the scenario fleshing out more than geopolitical consequence. It's really economic. Keith Alexander gives a wonderful comment at the end of a lot of speeches. He says that what we're seeing today is the largest wealth transfer in all of human history. And it is from the West to the East. And it doesn't really have its headquarters necessarily focused entirely on the United States, but anywhere where good ideas exist. Embraer in Brazil is under attack, and the Chinese C919 has some unique features of the wing that it didn't have before, and things like that that are just simply examples of intellectual property that is transiting out of one country and into the other. And it's simply a matter of power shift economic rather than power shift in a military or political fashion first. And I think it may be a tidal wave that's slow approaching. We tend to want to ride it. It's a very gentle wave. But by the time it crashes onto the beach, it'll be too late for us to catch up. And I think if you expand on that a little bit, bringing in the data that we currently have, give your scenarios a little more real flesh, it'll help this dialogue in Washington in particular. I agree with you very much with your assessment that we've kind of broken this up in so many pieces that we don't know how to do anything anymore. But by taking a scenario and collapsing it a little bit, fleshing it out with the data that we have, this will help in Washington immensely. It'll help bring the glue. The pieces are there. People talk about the individual pieces, but they don't all talk about them at the same time. When you bring them all together, it's a very forceful statement. Thanks.
Okay. Thoughts from our panel?
Yeah, the point of, it's broken into too many pieces, and we need to pull the pieces together. I think this is what we really need to try and do. And that's hopefully with the scenarios is the intention of that. So we've got these disparate components, but how when we try and sort of contextualize them and then look forward a couple of years, how can we then therefore get a better grip rather than being stuck in kind of a very sort of short-term environment, bombarded with emails or picking up the post newspaper and say, okay, this has happened, that's happened, and sort of gradually moving ahead that way. Yeah, it's very much welcome these scenarios. It would be greatly benefit looking more into injections of various different components to help to flesh them out even further. And hence, forums like these are the real ideal situation to do that, as well as kind of facilitated workshops. For just summary comments for those first two scenarios. The first one, how we're going forward at the moment, we may see the banks being hit even harder, but the real question is how might the social malaise in Europe, for example, impact society there? We have 25% plus unemployment in Spain. By no means is the Eurozone crisis over. How might that sort of, for example, impact on individuals there as they see that they've kind of like a lost generation? How might that sort of mesh itself in with the cyber environment with disgruntled individuals? Could you see sort of cyber and virtual and real world terrorist groups may be developing and moving forward for that? Under what conditions could that potentially occur? And therefore we can help to move ahead, anticipate those potential adverse features. For the second scenario is looking at, well, how safe are cyber offensive capabilities in government hands? Are they secure enough that they're not going to get accessed by other parties looking to use them for offensive purposes? I think those are kind of the questions we need to ask. A large number of countries are developing fairly credible offensive cyber capabilities, but how safe are they? What measures do we have in place to try and get round to them sort of getting out into the other domains? And what is the strategies that what issues do we need to talk about? A lot of the cyber discussions are kept within more kind of the classified network in terms of infrastructure vulnerability, etc. Okay, that's valuable for looking at what may be attacks and how and when. But part of the wider debate of what actions do we need to start to think about now to try and prevent and avert some of those more adverse implications coming through. And hopefully that would just remain as a scenario, not have components of that coming to life.
Anyone else? I'd like to just weigh in a little bit. Just on one facet. Mark Twain had a habit of disappearing now and then. Once actually disappeared for so long and so effectively that he'd been rumors in the press that he was dead. A young journalist finally found him in Elmira, New York, in a rooming house, and he said, "Rumors of my demise are premature." And I think we need to think about that with the nation state and with strategy. I mean, there's clearly globalization has changed things. We're not in the same Westphalian system that we were in, let's say, at the outbreak of World War II. That said, nation states still move and shake a lot of things out there, including in the cyber world. And I think we should not be deluded when General Alexander says this is the greatest transfer of wealth in human history, that there is a reason for the transfer of that wealth. And there is a Chinese strategy in this that has got 3 points, 2010, 2020, and 2050. There is a reason that they are stealing that technology. It is not just money. Money's good, and Chinese state-owned enterprises in particular are into money. But there's something else going on here, and I think we should not delude ourselves to believe that this is entirely economic. So, anything else from the audience? Sir. Oh, he's coming.
My name is Tony. It's on?
Yeah, it's on.
My name is Tony Spadaro. I applaud your use of scenarios. I think it's an excellent way to get folks to think not only about the good and the bad, but to think and to discuss. But I fear there's an element that might not, a factor that might not have been included in your work, and I'd like your comment on it. The factor is this. We are developing technology at a rate that I will describe as an accelerated Moore's Law. Things are getting, you very properly have projected that there's going to be a nexus between digital and biological and manufacturing technologies and all of that. But in all of your scenarios, you have governments and large organizations interacting as a factor. And have you properly taken into account the inherent, increasingly lack of agility of those organizations in adapting to the environments they're going to be seeing?
Yep. For the lack of agility, I think the third scenario kind of alludes to that to some degree, whereby it has to be driven by citizen-led groups and organizations to overcome the lack of agility from the more established entities, whether it be government structures or private institutions. That's a great one. You can bring that out even further to say, well, how can you try and make these groups more agile? What does it need to take to become more effective to respond to various events?
Yeah, I think one of the things you've got a problem is the same way we all do now is that there's a Moore's Law that's going on within the technology that's beyond Moore's Law. I would go back to the fact that this thing has really been only shaking for the last 10 years or so in ways that are so deep within the economy now and so deep within the military, so deep within the government. We haven't experienced this before. And my concern, and this is why I always like the scenarios, is that at least it gives you a shot at thinking about what the permutations and combinations of this thing may be. I really don't know whether or not we still understand. I don't think we do. I don't think we understand the full implications of this yet. We just don't. I mean, and you and I are really not going to understand it because we're sort of telecommunications based. The people who are going to have to live with it, and thanks a lot, people underneath the 30, I appreciate that. You're the guys who are going to have to live with this thing. And you're going to have to live with, with all kinds of things, especially as it crosses into the biometric area. I mean, biology, the biometric stuff's been fascinating to me. It's been the coming industry for the last 25 years. I think it's now arrived. And that one, when that starts to tie in, I think is going to present some extremely interesting scenarios, which actually will push the government, will put some social mores on the line. I'll give you one social more that we're dealing with right now, and I'll leave it at that, which would be interesting in terms of scenario building, I think, and that is the issue of privacy. again, when I'm inflicting my class upon 25-year-olds, I always look at them and say, all right, how many people here have got a Facebook account? And everybody's hand sort of shoots up. I said, well, congratulations, you just made Mark Zuckerberg a billionaire. You gave it away. Isn't that nice? And by the way, not only did you give it away, but you've given it away permanently. I am not a fan of Eric Schmidt. I consider him one of the worst parts of Silicon Valley. I think he's an arrogant person, and I think he deserves to be slapped down, but he says some interesting things once in a while. One of which is, gee whiz, you guys have to realize, as he said, I think to some college class recently, that everything that you say and write on the internet is now going to be there permanently. What Mom used to say about our permanent record. Well, I wonder whether he thought about that before he made the first billion or not. But still, we now live in a total information society. And that is something we cannot get rid of. It's one of the reasons why, everybody's all shocked about this business with NSA and we're collecting these phone records and that phone records. Take a look at Google. Take a look at Amazon. Take a look at LL Bean. You want to know why those cute little advertisements end up on your computer? You want to know why you get polled in certain ways? You want to know how the Obama people were so successful in a re-election? I worked on the Romney side. We did the best 1970s campaign you could come up with. That's the bad news. Here's the good news for the Obama people, and that is that they successfully took data mining, data management, and used it to their benefit. People would come to my neighborhood to meet the Obama people, those who would vote. They didn't knock on my door, but I sure as hell know who they knocked on. So we now live in a surveillance society. We now live in a total information society, and that is a social impact which I still don't think we've got a handle on, and may not for years after.
Yeah, so one comment I wanted to make to the agility, I think it's true that a lot of large corporations have trouble with agility, of course, and certainly governments do. But to Ron's point earlier, we do have a lot of small businesses that give us a lot of agility that's somewhat unique, not totally, but fairly unique in the world. And I think that's a place we need to look. And one of the difficulties that small businesses have is they've got to play on the internet, of course. Everybody does. How do they secure themselves? The expertise, not just the budget, but the expertise to know what's appropriate for their business. I think that's a gap we've got to look at both from a technology, economic, and policy perspective.
Great. Next question, gentleman in the back.
Hi, Ian Garner with Site B Consulting. I want to bring it back to the idea of a cyber doctrine for the United States. Oh, since we are the center of the universe, as you noted. I think you mentioned that it's kind of muddy right now. CIA, NSA, DOD, DHS, NIST, so many agencies. The idea of a cyber doctrine is to have a collective movement forward, right? As in the International Strategy for Cyberspace, that came out. How are we going to operate, as vague as it was, how are we going to operate overseas, internationally, with partners, building relationships? That being said, I believe it's an issue of jurisdiction at this point, right? Everybody's fighting for dollars, and of course that's the bottom line, but it's an issue of jurisdiction. Who has offensive, who has defensive, who has social responsibility, who has corporate responsibility, who protects the citizenry. How close are we to consolidating all of that into another agency, right? That outside of DHS, outside of DOD, the U.S. Department of Cybersecurity, right? So I feel that should be a valid concept. Thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the challenges of this, let's put it this way. Here's my logic for it, for better or worse. At $15 to $16 trillion, we're still running about 20 to 21, 22% of the world's economy. So we've got some drive here. We are the largest superpower in terms of playing on the net. It doesn't make us huge compared to the rest of the world because there are other people who have equal kinds of powers, depending upon the circumstance. The driving force behind making any kind of doctrinal decisions about how we proceed is going to have to be the U.S. government, because it does one thing. It does social good. There is no profit in this for making up a doctrine, okay? It's just not. Why in the world would Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, with some mild exceptions, set out a doctrine for the United States? Why should they? What difference does it make to them? One of the things that government does do is provide a social good. One of them is governance. So it has to be taken into consideration what businesses, what citizens are doing. But ultimately, it sort of falls into their laps. Now, one of the challenges of this, say, versus the Cold War, is just what you said, because everybody's got their fingers in this one early. So we're building this ship while we're trying to sail it. One of the problems here within Washington is, we're caught in this alphabet soup here. One of the problems outside is people see this alphabet soup and go, "What? What do you guys want out of us?" It's the old joke from any business. The government knocks on the door. The question is, are you from the IRS? The answer is no. Then what the hell do you want? So you're trying to engage in cyber, which crosses a whole lot of boundaries here. 312 million people, 30 million businesses, 50 states, 17,600 municipalities in one form or another. But the idea behind a scenario developed within the government and including people from the private sector, including privacy people as well, including those people who in the various so-called ISACs are involved with the various parts of industry, etc. That's the important part. Can you get some kind of just a basic agreement? What do we want to do? We want to keep it free for everybody, and we want to keep it safe, and we want to promote business and personal freedom. All right, let's just take that as the scenario. That's only going to come from one place. There has to be a consensus for that, because what's happening right now is what you're just talking about, which is everybody's scattered in different directions doing their own thing, and they should. That's what the hell they're supposed to do. That's the good news. The bad news is that everybody's scattered in doing what it is that they're doing, which means you're wasting a lot of resources, you're wasting a lot of time. And by the way, so far with all the government efforts, I have seen no decrease in the number of attacks. I have seen some increase in the number. I mean, we've played poor soul in this thing. I think one of the disadvantages of Snowden right now is he's laid out for the fact we're not the poor soul in this. We've actually done a pretty good job of going out there and kicking some butt. But until we come to some kind of an overall agreement from which you can build strategies and from which you can build tactics, we're going to keep running around like this. So when you do get different scenarios, all of a sudden the U.S. government's got like 25 ships that it's got to steer around. It also does not produce a positive effect in terms of the private sector. I mean, one of the issues right now is, who do we talk to? You've got Suzanne Spalding over at DHS. She's leading an effort to talk to the private sector. Ask me how that's going right now that the private sector and that relationships are getting leaked all over the place. We've got the White House talking to them. We've got CIA and DNI talking to them. There are too many people doing too many separate things. And it's just the way the government's built. Like I said before, this is not about, we don't trust governments. We have it in different categories. This is a cross issue. This crosses individual. This crosses government. This crosses corporations. Everybody in the society is now involved with this thing. So if that's the case, there's only going to be one group that's going to lead this thing. It's got to be led, by the way, out of the White House. I'm sorry, that's what you pay this guy for, $400,000 a year. And not just to have a single guy at the NSC sitting there. You've got to have somebody who's going to be consistently involved with this thing, because this will be the major problem here for about the next 10 years, at least in terms of cyberspace. How are we going to coordinate on this thing? It leads to how we're going to do internationally. We got our keister handed to us in Dubai. We walked in there and said, hell no, we won't go. And the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians said, good. We'll take care of it for you. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we can't do. We can't stomp our foot and just say no. We've got to have some kind of scenario, some kind of doctrine that says, here's what we want to do. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but that's what I could come up with.
Well, let me put my 2 cents worth in if I may. Ron's absolutely right. I mean, the government, it's big, it's unwieldy. Unfortunately, it has to be that way, so there's no point in complaining about it. And I absolutely agree with you. This has got to come out of the White House. And just contrast that for a moment with, for example, the British approach, where in 2009 they literally elevated this to cabinet level. And this is, it seems to me that if we are serious, and I'm saying that really hypothetically, if we are serious, this is going to take some hard work, heavy lifting from the White House. And it will not be finished by this president. It could be started by this president, but it's going to take a draft doctrine that frankly is going to be attacked.
and will probably never really in full finished form see the light of day, but it's the only way to get anything done. Now, there's a little bit of salutary news in all of this, too. I did a thing at the Naval Academy last week comparing the non-debate that we're having now with the, well, as it turns out, non-debate that we had at the beginning of the nuclear era. Everybody has this image that there was this great open debate, which there was eventually, by the way, but not until the late 50s and the early 60s. It was dominated by secrecy. It was dominated by alphabet soup. Spies were fished out of this, that, and the other place in the government routinely. And the whole big debate, the biggest debate of the nuclear era, was about building the super, whether the United States should build a hydrogen bomb. That was a debate by leak on Sunday morning television. That was not intentional. And then, of course, when it came out that we were considering this, then there was a big debate. I'm not sure, you know, I guess if you look at the situation with cyber, it's really terrible, horrible, abysmal, but it was ever so. I mean, this is the way democracies hobble through the building of a doctrine. Yes, we need a doctrine, but I don't know that it can be much different other than it really needs some leadership and some impetus to get this thing going. I think we got time for one more. If this lady right here, you have the last word, ma'am. And you need to wait for the microphone for your last word, though.
My name is Marcella Useby. I'm with the FBI, and I have this is mainly for Dr. Shepard. In future scenarios, are you going to be discussing the types of tools or emerging technologies that in 2023 that cyber criminals or actors might be using to carry out these types of attacks or compromises? Again, in 2023.
Yeah, the technology component is naturally really critical for this, and the aspirational ones, the third out of the scenarios talked about some elements, say the cyber wand, for example, to detect compromised critical circuitry. So yeah, that's something to looking to build on that even further by finding out and just identifying what other kind of emerging technologies that are just being researched now that could be used for offensive purposes down the line. What aspects could emerge in the future that we're not really considering at the moment? For example, in the neuroscience and the biometric areas. That's being championed more sort of great promise. What could that offer? But what are the kind of the downsides of that could provide? And what, therefore, are the regulatory legislative environment that we might need to try and create to try and get ahead of that curve, so make sure that when these technologies are developed and out in the environment, that we have some framework that we can try and control them and make sure they're used for the right purpose, and to hopefully reduce them being used for the wrong reasons, to adverse elements.
Ron, Fred, any final words?
Yeah, I just echo yours, I think, which is that, you know, we're really only about 5 or 10 years into this thing. And frankly, in the first 5 or 10, I mean, we all who are old enough to remember have this wonderful glimmer of how everything worked well in the Cold War. And everybody knows it's not true either. I mean, keep in mind the National Security Act of 1947, that's 2 years after the war, created the Air Force, created the NSC, created CIA. It took another few years, really into the 1950s, to get a handle on the budgetary issues. Everybody was submitting their own budgets to the Hill from DOD. Robert McNamara stopped that in '61. Heaven only knows David made a living on arms control. You know, people arguing over going to zero or adding more, SALT 1, SALT 2, all kinds of other initials. So, and again, I say we lived, you know, at that point also with an existential threat. I mean, I do not dismiss this threat. I never dismiss the threat of terrorism. I would never dismiss the threat of cyber terrorism. On the other hand, as I said, we had the capability, or we were going to have to deal with, on the order of 1,500 ICBMs with multiple launches between 5 and 10 minutes coming into us. This is not the same level. We can make this thing work. But it is going to take a few years, I think, to hash it out. I don't think there's any other way around it.
Brent?
A couple of things that I wanted to mention. Based on back to the scenarios, the question on technology a minute ago and the cyber wand. first thing I thought of when I read that part of the scenario is, how long will it take to hack that cyber wand? And who's going to protect the supply chain of just that device that's protecting the rest of the supply chain, apparently? It gets pretty complicated. One of the things that I expected to come out a bit more in this discussion, getting to things like doctrine and how we view cyberspace, is this idea of cyberspace as a country or a nation almost of its own. And the reason I bring that up is that I think there are a lot of folks who are active in building things in cyberspace, really talented people who have clever ideas, who have a lot of loyalty to this notion of the internet, just a phenomenal amount. I sort of understand, and I sort of see the gleam in their eye, and I understand the free internet and why it's important and so forth. It's a little bit harder for me to fully invest myself in, maybe because of my age, and I've lived in a world with boundaries, and the U.S. Constitution is something I think a lot of. But I think we have to get a handle on that idea, that notion of cyberspace, and the loyalty that a lot of people have to that whole idea and how that fits with doctrine. We can have all the doctrine we want in this country, and maybe team up with Great Britain and Australia and Canada and others that we normally team up with, but if bad actors in Eastern Europe are not being stopped there because the doctrine doesn't extend there, or to Africa or South America or wherever, we've got a limiting factor there that we've got to deal with. So I think whatever doctrine we come up with has got to address that, and diplomacy and other things have to come into play.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the disenfranchisement factor is getting to be a strong one, and I think it's hitting at some interesting ages right now. And I apologize to the young people in this audience, but look around, if you're a female here, at the young men who are in their mid-20s and beware of them. There's nothing worse than disenfranchised kids in their mid-20s, whoever they may be, and the net has served as a world for them. What I would say, and there's also, again, the disenfranchisement from the society, which is, again, the internet can actually help promote, in fact, where you are living in that internet world. The reason for the doctrine was how we position ourselves to try to project that into cyberspace as well. Because I think one of the problems right now is we're sort of saying, no, well, that doesn't solve anything. You're quite right. I mean, it's not going to stop a bunch of guys in Eastern Europe, but if you can get Eastern Europe to agree, hey, listen, there's some fundamental things here that we probably need to do, you still have a shot, because until something else happens, nation state and the Treaty of Westphalia are still going to stand for a while. Not as strong, but still going to stand.
All right. It's now my privilege to introduce to you General Al Gray, 29th Commandant of the Marine Corps, who's the chairman of our Board of Regents, and also thank you to our panelists and to you, ladies and gentlemen. General Gray.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, on behalf of our chairman, Mike Schwetman, and all of us at Potomac, thank you. Very, very good. I'm sorry I missed the first half of your seminar. I was at Quantico, and I applied cyber-type command techniques, allowing enough time, but I failed, of course, to understand the traffic pattern between here and Quantico, and so I was late. I thought that and I had a few sidebar conversations here while I was here, but the scenario idea was great, and obviously you sparked a whole different kind of thought process here amongst the audience, and so I want to thank you for that. Doctrine is hard to come by, as everybody knows. It takes a long time, a lot of thought. There were some maneuver warfare statements made by a couple of you today, understanding commander's intent, a couple echelons up, a couple echelons down, being able to operate on a decentralized basis, etc. That doctrine emerged really in the late late 60s and early 70s in the Marine Corps, and by 76 we had a fairly good group of people that were working on that kind of thing, but it really didn't come into fruition until 1987 or so, and it takes a long time. Now, having said that, maybe we can learn a few lessons from history. One of our biggest challenges in the Cold War was, of course, the submarine threat and a submarine warfare kind of capability, which we had to develop in the United States because of the great threat from the Soviet Union. And there was no simple answer. There was no one idea takes care of everything. And so what we did in the Navy really was begin to pick off a little bit at a time. And we sort of treated it like an apple. We took a little bite here, made this better, made this better, made this better, applied technology, applied tactics, thinking, et cetera, and the first thing you know, we got to be by 1976 and 1978, we were darn good at anti-submarine warfare, and we really had it figured out. We could block them off in North Norway and that kind of thing, and it looked pretty good. So maybe a partial solution here would be to begin to take a little bit of this challenge and try to solve it. You know, the most serious and those kinds of things, and sometimes the less serious challenges lend themselves to some solutions as well, and begin to put this thing together. I agree wholeheartedly that we have to have a strong idea or strong thought process from the White House. I would hope it would be policy and that kind of thing, an overarching policy and a policy that's dynamic. And it has to take into consideration what I call globality, this whole global interdependence idea. You can argue about that, you can talk about it, you can decide whether we had global interdependence 500 years ago and so on. That's not the issue there. That's for the academics to talk about. But the real facts of life is that we're all in this together now on the global scene. There is no more a U.S.-only technology and science and that kind of thing. When the National Science Foundation or someone like that comes up with an idea, that's international, and so is everything else. And so we've got to understand how to play in this arena, and I don't think we have done that very well. And so that's an area that I think we should really focus on. You talked about the infrastructure and that kind of thing. It's very clear that our infrastructure has got some weaknesses to it, and we ought to take steps on a gradual thought process and a total systems approach to improve our infrastructure and to come up with some alternatives and that kind of thing. You're quite right. I think on the military side, we'll be able to operate whether we lose some of these communications in this or not, because that's the way we are. But it's far more than military. It's the whole interagency process. It's the whole government. It's everybody. And the final thing I'll say, and then I'll turn everybody loose. There's a little bit of a dilemma here now, and there's a lot of mistrust in the government and that kind of thing. And this really bothers me deeply, having served in the government for 41 years on active duty, and then still very much involved. At the National Security Agency and elsewhere in our intelligence community and elsewhere in government, we've got thousands and thousands of young men and women who are totally dedicated, who are honest, who are doing everything they can to do it right. The National Security Agency bends over backwards to do this thing right, and it's not. They haven't been intercepting people's phone calls and messages. They've been monitoring, phone calls. And if they want to take a phone call and look into that further, they got to get a whole new finding. And the media has not played this very straight either. For example, the first thing they said was that the courts are a rubber stamp. Now, that's hogwash, because only they turned down 11 or 12. The vetting process in the way up, whether it's the FBI, whether it's the National Security Agency, whether it's any of the other agencies, the vetting process alone strips out 90% of the requests, if you will. And so those kind of things need to be brought out. And we need to, whether we like it or not, we need to trust our government and trust our people. If we continue to worry about that, we're not going to get anywhere. That doesn't mean that we don't have some bad people and this and that, and people have mentioned insider threat and all that kind of thing. But trust me, you won't find a harder working, more dedicated American than Keith Alexander. And as far as Jim Clapper is concerned and untruthful, I've known him since he was Marine Corporal. He's made some mistakes through the years. He left the Marine Corps and went in the Air Force. But outside of that, you can take Jim Clapper to the bank. And so we need to understand that. And anybody in the media who disagrees with that, tell them to call me. Thank you for being here.
Good seeing you. Not too bad.
I think we'll put you back in government.
Every once in a while. Well, so this, if the Romney thing didn't work out, it wouldn't happen.
I'll see it. You're going to be as helpful.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks, General.
Oh, thanks very much.
Thanks, Dylan. Appreciate you coming.